Welcome to Slabbed Portfolios, the podcast where we break down the biggest comics, collectibles, and action figures so you can collect smarter and avoid costly mistakes. Please make sure you are subscribed for all of our breaking news and episodes. Today, we're talking about what is probably going to be one of the biggest comic related events of all of 2026 from both a movie perspective and a collector perspective. Although we do have Avengers Doomsday coming out in December, we will see how that goes. But today is about Spider-Man Brand New Day, releasing July 31st, 2026. I know I am super excited about it. I'm sure the rest of you are as well. And honestly, whenever a Spider-Man movie comes out, the comic market pays full attention. And I'm talking about live action, animation, any sort of Spider-Man IP that comes out, people pay attention to it. It doesn't even matter whether the movie ends up being amazing, controversial, divisive, or somewhere in between. Spider-Man movies move books. They always have. That it just is what it is. But what makes Brand New Day especially interesting is that it doesn't feel like a normal Spider-Man movie cycle. It feels like a reset point, a rebuilding phase after everything that happened in No Way Home. The multiverse chaos, the emotional ending, Peter Parker essentially becoming anonymous again. This movie appears to be shifting the tone back toward a more grounded, street-level Spider-Man story, and that has huge implications for certain comic books, and that's what we want to talk about. But before we even get into the books, let's talk about the movie itself, because there's a lot here collectors should be paying attention to. Tom Holland is obviously returning as Peter Parker, and honestly, this may be the most important Spider-Man movie of his entire run. Not because it has the biggest spectacle, but because this is the movie that has to redefine who this version of Spider-Man is now that all the Tony Stark connections and multiverse support systems are basically stripped away. This version of Peter is isolated now, broke, anonymous, more vulnerable, and that creates the perfect setup for a more classic Spider-Man tone. And if Marvel and Sony really lean into that grounded atmosphere, it creates a very different kind of comic market response compared to the multiverse era. Instead of audiences chasing giant crossover speculation, they start reconnecting with core Spider-Man mythology again. And that's where books like Amazing Fantasy 15, which has taken a beating recently, and Amazing Spider-Man 1 always begin to re-enter the spotlight. Because no matter what direction Spider-Man movies take, every major Spider-Man media event tends to strengthen the overall importance of foundational Spider-Man keys. Now, AF-15 is obviously one of the most important comic books ever printed. First appearance of Spider-Man, one of the pillars of the entire hobby. There are very few books that exist above it historically. And what's fascinating about AF-15 is that it almost behaves independently from the rest of the market sometimes. It isn't just a comic anymore. It's practically a cultural artifact. Every new generation that discovers Spider-Man eventually learns about that book and hopes to get a copy. And Spider-Man movies continuously create new generations of fans. That's the important part. Every successful Spider-Man adaptation refreshes the pipeline of future collectors. Kids become collectors. Casual fans become serious fans. And eventually many of them begin tracing the character backward through comic history until they land at Amazing Fantasy 15. Now, obviously, most collectors will never own that book, but the mythology surrounding it affects the entire Spider-Man key ecosystem, and that includes Amazing Spider-Man number 1. ASM 1 has always lived in this incredibly powerful collector position because it represents the beginning of Spider-Man's actual ongoing universe. This is where the Rogue Gallery starts forming. This is where Spider-Man stops being a one-off concept and becomes a world. And historically, Spider-Man keys tend to rise together during major film cycles. Not always at the same rate and not always equally, but there's usually upward pressure across the board because collector attention concentrates around the entire mythology. Now, where Brand New Day becomes especially interesting is the villain lineup, because this movie appears to be leaning into more grounded street-level threats, and that changes which books collectors begin focusing on. One major character reportedly appearing is Tombstone, played by Condon. And honestly, Tombstone is one of those Spider-Man villains that comic collectors have always appreciated more than the mainstream audience has. He works incredibly well in grounded crime-driven stories because he feels dangerous in a believable way. He's not a giant cosmic villain. He's cold, methodical, and intimidating. And if the movie captures that tone correctly, Tombstone-related books could quietly gain momentum, especially among collectors who prefer darker street-level Spider-Man stories over multiverse spectacle. But the character that I think could really surprise people market-wise is Scorpion. Michael Mando reportedly returning as Mac Gargan is a very smart move because he already has the intensity and personality for the role. And comic fans have been waiting years to see what Marvel and Sony would actually do with Scorpion in a larger capacity, which brings us to Amazing Spider-Man number 20, the first appearance of Scorpion. This is really a fascinating Silver Age Spider-Man key because it's important, recognizable, and historically respected, but it's often overshadowed by some of the bigger Spider-Man villain books, and honestly, that may not last forever. Scorpion has always had strong visual identity potential. The costume is memorable, the rivalry with Spider-Man is personal, and Gargan himself represents one of the classic themes of Spider-Man villains: obsession and transformation gone wrong. Historically, ASM 20 has been viewed as a solid Spider-Man villain key rather than an elite tier mega key, but media adaptations change perception. If audiences emotionally connect with Scorpion as a major antagonist, that book could start climbing in desirability very quickly. And here's the thing collectors sometimes underestimate about Spider-Man villains. Once they become culturally recognizable outside comic circles, their first appearances become much stronger long-term assets. We've seen it happen repeatedly with Spider-Man books. Now, while ASM 20 is the obvious Scorpion book, I think the sneaky book to watch is Amazing Spider-Man number 19, the first appearance of Gargan himself. And honestly, I've always loved that cover. It's actually one of my favorite Silver Age Spider-Man covers of all time. But beyond my personal preference, ASM 19 has another thing working in its favor: collector psychology. As major first appearances become more expensive, collectors naturally start looking for earlier appearances, precursor appearances, and character setup books connected to the same storyline. And if Scorpion becomes a major breakout villain in Brand New Day, collectors may start reevaluating ASM 19 more seriously because it represents the introduction of Gargan before the transformation into Scorpion. That's the kind of secondary key movement we often see after successful comic movies, and Brand New Day should be no different. Now, another massive factor in this movie is the inclusion of the Punisher, played by Bernthal, played by John Bernthal, obviously. And honestly, Bernthal's Punisher has already built a strong reputation among Marvel fans as it is. His version of Frank Castle feels grounded, violent, emotionally damaged, and believable in a way audiences responded to very strongly. And if Marvel fully integrates that version of Punisher into Spider-Man's street-level world, it creates a very interesting crossover effect for comic collectors, because ASM 129 is already one of the biggest Bronze Age keys in existence. The first appearance of the Punisher is one of the most iconic covers Marvel ever produced. It is a massively important character introduction that has transcended comic collecting entirely. And ASM 129 behaves differently than most books because Punisher fans, Spider-Man fans, Marvel collectors, Bronze Age key collectors, and even general investors all overlap on that book. That creates extremely broad demand. Now, every time Punisher re-enters live action in a meaningful way, ASM 129 tends to regain momentum because people remember how historically important that first appearance really is. And if Brand New Day successfully captures that darker, more grounded street-level tone, ASM 129 could benefit tremendously because Punisher fits naturally into that atmosphere. The key thing here is tone consistency. When characters feel like they belong emotionally within a film's world, audiences become more attached to them. And stronger emotional attachment usually translates into stronger comic interest. Now, another thing interesting about Spider-Man movies historically is how they affect the entire ecosystem surrounding Spider-Man keys. Even books not directly tied to the movie often rise in attention simply because Spider-Man himself returns to the center of popular culture again. That's why AF-15 and ASM-1 almost always receive renewed attention during Spider-Man movie cycles even when they aren't directly connected to the plot. Spider-Man is one of the few characters in comics whose popularity genuinely spans generations almost endlessly. Every era gets its Spider-Man, and every new movie creates another wave of fans who eventually become collectors. That generational cycle is one of the reasons Spider-Man keys have historically remained so resilient over time. Now, personally, I think what collectors should watch most closely after Brand New Day releases is not just immediate price spikes, but liquidity and availability. Do high-grade ASM 20 copies start disappearing faster? Does ASM 19 suddenly get more auction attention because collectors begin viewing it differently? Does ASM 129 tighten up because Punisher demand increases again? Those are usually the early indicators that the market is repositioning certain books. Because comic markets often move psychologically before they move numerically. And Brand New Day feels like the kind of movie that could shift the psychology surrounding Spider Man books once again. Not through a giant multiverse spectacle, but by reconnecting audiences with the core emotional identity of Spider Man himself. Grounded struggles, street level danger, flawed heroes, and deeply personal villains. And if Marvel and Sony get that tone right, there's a very good chance that a lot of Spider Man books become even more desirable over the next couple years than they already are. Which feels almost impossible considering how strong Spider Man keys already are historically. But that's the thing about Spider Man. The character never really disappears culturally. Every few years, he comes roaring back into the center of the hobby all over again, and Brand New Day might end up being the next major chapter in that cycle. Thanks for listening to Slabbed Portfolios. I hope the information in this episode continues to help your collecting journey. And I'll see you guys on the next one.